Thanks so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I was saying during the break that I'm really happy. You know, I sometimes am asked to speak and kind of buzz in, give a talk, and then leave, and I'm really glad that I allocated the time to stay here all day because I think it's been, and I think from my discussions with folks in the audience that everybody thinks it's been a great day. Really worth the time. So that's, thanks. It's been really good. I'd like to talk, I'll be talking, as it says, about new business models that are affecting consumer IT and the implications for health IT, which I believe it will, in fact, change health IT. Just to clarify, because I noticed in the brochure that it identified me as the thing I did right when I got out of college, which was working as a computer consultant for a Wall Street bank. That was, I'm shocked, honestly to say, 20 years ago. And so it's hardly the most, I think, prominent, or honestly, I can barely remember it. I worked as a computer consultant for a bank. Then I decided, for reasons that, again, are lost in history, to go back to school and become a physician, pediatrician. I wound up doing the Epidemic Intelligence Service Fellowship at CDC, which is basically training as an outbreak investigator, and worked for CDC for some years. And later, had the unfortunate experience of being advanced within the hierarchy at our Ministry of Health, Department of Health and Human Services, to the point when I was sort of stuck in an office doing lots of bureaucratic stuff. I left that job about 10 years ago to found, with my partner Rose Donna, to found a company called Dyne with the idea of applying web and mobile to problems that we saw primarily within global health, because most of my career at CDC was global health. Simultaneously, I've been, for the last 10 years, an assistant professor at Georgetown University. My clinical practice is really limited to about 4 or 5 hours a week, very, very minimal. Unfortunately, well, there I've given it away. Unfortunately, that does expose me to electronic medical record systems, and I'll be discussing that as we go along. Because when you talk about being a doctor and you say you're a doctor in something else, something about being a doctor is so powerful that everybody assumes the other thing takes up a tiny portion of your time. I just wanted to make it clear that that's the reverse for me. I spend 95% of my time on Dyne, which is a Nairobi-based company. We're based in Nairobi. All of our programmers and technicians are, and support staff are Kenyan. And we make something called Magpi, which is the most widely used mobile data collection software in global health and international development. But today, honestly, I'd certainly love to talk to you about Magpi till the cows come home. But today I'm not going to talk to you about Magpi. I'm going to talk to you about some other things. I'm going to break my talk up into 3 parts. The first is that giant sucking sound. That's about new business models and how they're affecting the distribution of programmers and the distribution of resources. Then I'm going to lead you through my experience using the electronic medical record system of Georgetown Hospital in the chapter called "This Button Must Never Be Pressed." And then we'll talk about the implications for these business models and the disruption that is going to ensue, or that actually is ensuing. So first, let's talk about that giant sucking sound, and we'll begin with the consumerization of IT. Anybody in the room, if you've not heard of this term, can you raise your hand, the consumerization of IT? Okay, so just a couple people are raising it. And normally, I find that when people talk about it, this concept is kind of mixed up with the idea of bring your own device, something which roughly started with things like the iPhone, and then later the Android phone, iPads, where people want to bring their own devices into the office to replace, to use them instead of whatever technology their office is providing for them. I want to go back much, much further than 2007 when the iPhone came out to really what was the beginning of the consumerization of technology. Let's go back 30 years. Now, I know many of you in the audience don't remember back that far, but for those of you who need a reminder, back 30 years ago, Michael Jackson had just released Billie Jean, which was an enormous hit. I remember that very well. McDonald's, amazingly, had just released Chicken McNuggets for the first time. That's a real fun fact. And because I needed something about Canada coming up from the United States, I found, to my pleasure, that my own hometown team, the New York Islanders, beat Edmonton for the Stanley Cup back in 1983. I know. Well, they haven't done it since, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. But something else was going on about 30 years ago. And if you looked in advertisements in just regular old newspapers and magazines, you would have seen that going on. And what it was that you began to see ads for computers in regular publications, in regular newspapers, magazines, the New York Times, just the hometown paper, which you had never seen before. What was going on here? Well, basically, computerization and miniaturization and cost-cutting and innovation had proceeded so much with computer technology that finally the cost was down low enough where people who were manufacturing this realized they could sell these not just to who they'd sold it to before, which was huge institutions, you know, NASA, for example, but they could actually sell it to us. And they realized there are a lot more individuals than there are large institutions, so potentially this would be an enormous moneymaker. And this led to the graph that we see here. You could see that back in 1983, that red line was just starting to lift off of zero. So the number of computers that were sold, computers really of any kind, was numbered in the tens of thousands prior to the early 1980s, because the computers we were talking about were mainframe computers. But when the PC started to come out, including those very primitive, the early Macintosh, IBM PC, the one on the right that we just saw was the TRS-80 from Radio Shack. When these things came out, as you can see, the use of computers, and importantly, the sales of computers, just skyrocketed. And so what we had over the course of the last 30 years is a progression from a time when the audience for computers, the buyer for computers was universities, government, large corporations, a steady progression, a steady honing of techniques to sell computers and software to run on those computers directly to you, which I'm sure has not reached its culmination with the iPhone, but it certainly feels like that sometimes, doesn't it? The iPhone is a system to directly inject software into your pocket and directly extract a payment from your pocket back to the people who make that software. That kind of efficiency has unleashed enormous creativity in the world to sell software directly to you. The barriers to selling information technology, and really I'm primarily talking about software, directly to consumers have completely fallen, have been demolished. And what is beneficial for us is that because the barriers to actually being a software developer have lowered so much, anybody can be a software developer. You know, we have people who've done work for my company. When we have little odds and ends to do, we contract on the internet with teenagers in Kiev and Bangladesh, you know, graphic designers in all these different places. With software, now we have an enormous pool of talent we're drawing from all around the world to be able to do this. Immense competition, immense price competition, and the software that they're building. Think of the software that you use nowadays in your personal life. There's no lock-in. You know, if you use one email program, you can pretty easily switch to another email program, and email's probably the stickiest thing that you've got, right? If you use Pandora, you can switch to Spotify the next day. There's no stickiness to it. That means they have to constantly be working to keep you happy, which is very nice. The economic consequence of this is shown by this graph. So the first graph at the top is all enterprise software sold in the United States. That's currently it's about $175 billion budget per year, right? $175 billion. But as you can see even from the shape of just those 3 points, this is leveling off. Enterprise IT spending, enterprise software spending is plateauing. But if we look at the consumer app market, now this is not consumer software, folks. This is just mobile apps for things like iPhones and Android phones, just to consumers. This is a market for a product that didn't exist in 2006. We pretty much have gone from 0 to $50 billion over the course of the time from 2008 to 2013, and this is expected to triple from 2013 to 2016. So just as enterprise software spending is slowing, app spending is skyrocketing. And these are very, very different methods of selling software. The people who sell software to institutions, they sell it in a very different way than the people who sell software to you and I via our mobile device. First of all, when you sell to institutions, generally you're selling to a relatively low volume. You're not selling to tens of millions or hundreds of millions. You're selling to thousands if you're lucky, tens of thousands if you're super lucky, of institutions. And therefore, you have to make a high cost per sale. But when you're selling to, you know, it could be 100 million people, you know, 150 million people within the United States, then what we're talking about is very high volume and very low cost per. When you're selling to institutions, generally the contracts are long-term. You know, Georgetown is locked into a 10-year contract for its EMR system. Very, very sticky, very, very difficult to change, whether you like it or you don't. With most of the technology that we use personally nowadays, it's not very difficult to change if you're not happy with it. That keeps the people who are selling it to you on their toes. For institutional software, the buyer is not the user. I've asked every doctor I run across, every new doctor I meet at Georgetown where I practice, if they had anything to do with the choice of the electronic medical record system that we use at Georgetown, which was installed only 5 years ago. I've yet to meet anyone, not a single doctor or nurse, that had anything to do with the choice of it. Again, when you buy software, when you buy an app for your iPad, you're the user. You don't like it, you stop paying for it, or you stop buying it. And of course, for enterprise software, because of that plateau that we saw, the number of people who are developing enterprise software is dropping off, and the number of people who are developing and trying to develop hit apps for the consumer market is skyrocketing. Why? Because that's where the money is. Right? When was the last time you saw somebody who was coming out with a computer science degree from university who said, oh, I want to go work for, fill in the blank with some, large, ancient institution? Right? I mean, nobody wants to go work for, pardon me if there's someone from IBM in the room, it's a fine corporation. But people who are coming out of university, they don't want to go work for IBM. They don't even want to work for Google because that's too old and staid. And there's not enough money working for Google, right? I mean, Facebook and Twitter are like poaching people from Google because people don't want to work at Google because it's old-fashioned, right? That's the kind of intense competitive marketplace. And ask yourself, which of these two systems is more responsive to the need of the user? In the case of an EMR system, more responsive to the need of the doctor or the nurse or the other healthcare provider. It's very, very clear that the people with the business model on the right-hand side have to be responsive to stay in business. The people on the left, not so much. So what's that giant sucking sound? That giant sucking sound is the sound of a 30-year-long accelerating diversion of programming talent and revenue away from enterprise software and into consumer apps. This is what is called in finance a secular trend, right? This is a long-term, 30-year, we're going into 30-year trend that dramatically affects, we've been talking about innovation all day in fascinating conversations. When we talk about innovation in institutions, I have to tell you the fact that the best talent is being sucked over into the consumer side dramatically affects your ability to do stuff. Right? In government, we do not get the best talent for programming, I'm very sorry to say, because the money's not there. And that affects our ability to innovate. It's also the sound of people, as I mentioned with my reference to Kiev, etc., people who before this were completely excluded from the marketplace, people were excluded from any kind of meaningful work. I have programmers who work for me whose parents were subsistence farmers, whose parents live in a building made of sticks and mud, who don't even understand what their kids do. And these kids, because the internet connects to their country, and they were able to at least get a computer science degree, or in some cases, teach themselves how to program using free resources online at some internet cafe or a library or the school, they are now able to participate much, much more fully in the world economy. So with this long-term, dramatic change in the way resources are allocated with information technology, where does that leave us in healthcare? And that's where we come to chapter 2, which I call, "This button must never be pressed." I think everybody knows what this is. This is a word processor. I think all of us, for many of us, this was probably the first thing we ever did on a computer was a word processor, except maybe for games. And there are certain standards for the way things happen within word processors and within software that we use on a daily basis. Everybody is experienced with this, whether it's Microsoft Word or something else. For example, if I want to print a document in Microsoft Word, first I open and view the document I want to print, then I select the print command, and then in the dialog box that comes up, I press that blue button that says print. Right? Now, for those of you who are not experienced with this, let me go through it again. You open the document you want to print, you pick print from the file menu, and then you press the blue print button in the dialog that comes up. Right? So just to really put a nail on it, you select the document, you print, you print. The nice thing about the fact that this is the way that essentially every piece of software that we use is it decreases our need to be trained, right? Because we know what to expect from the software. We know how to print software that we've never used before. We know how to print something in it. Just like you pretty much know how to drive a car when you get into it, even if you've never driven that make of car before. Because cars all have the same kind of layout, and it all pretty much works the same. So let me show you some of the screenshots from the electronic medical record system that I use at Georgetown. And obviously all patient references have been removed from this. So sometimes when you're using this EMR system and you want to print, what you do is you press the print button, which opens up a dialog to allow you to select what you want to print, and then you press the print button to be able to continue printing. That's nice. It's not standard, right? It's not the way we do it in everything else, but I mean, fine. As long as it's consistent within the software, that would be fine, right? Unfortunately, sometimes when you want to print, you have to do it a different way. Sometimes when you print, and then it opens up a window, and then you have to press the close button to print, not the print button. Okay, so not only is it non-standard, but it's not even internally consistent. In fact, just within this piece of software, every time I'm in the clinic, when I'm printing things, sometimes I press print, then I select the document, then I press print again. Sometimes I select the document, press print, and then press close. Sometimes I select the document, press print, and then I have to press continue. Not consistent, not standard, increased training, very, very frustrating. This wastes a lot of time. When you start to use this, every time you do something, you don't know how it's going to work. You just don't know what's going to happen. But that's not my favorite element of the system. This second example is my favorite. In the dialogue, when you want to print a patient's clinical visit summary, a piece of paper you're going to hand to the patient that tells them what's happened and reiterates what you've spoken about, there's a button on the screen. I don't know if you can see that in the bottom right, and the button says close all. It says clear all. And there's some text that refers to that button, and you probably can't read it from way back then. Let me enlarge it for you. The text says, do not click clear all, as this will result in the patient not receiving a clinical visit summary with any information. Now, first of all, I'm trying to parse the English in that sentence. Not clicking it or clicking it will result in the patient not getting a summary with any information, which I guess is the same thing as saying will get a summary with no information. I'm not sure how many languages the person who programmed this user interface speaks, but I'm also not sure if English was actually one of them. The point of this example is that this button must never be pressed. This button must never be pressed. Stop and think about the fact that there's a button in the interface right next to the button you're supposed to press that should never be pressed. And I'll give you a moment while your minds blow, right? Yeah, it's pretty astonishing. We're talking, by the way, this is a $10, $20 million system, right? Last example, because at a certain point it just gets too painful. When you're looking at the patient's history, and folks here who are clinicians understand that the patient's history involves different segments, the history of present illness, past medical history, vital signs, et cetera, the different components of a patient's visit. And in this case, let me back it up. In this case, on the screen, you can see there's a row of buttons, little buttons that are all in one horizontal line across the bottom there. Those are the buttons, the tabs that go to those different sections. And just below that, there's two big buttons, and the two big buttons are the one on the left is the go back, and the one on the right is go forward, the next button and the previous button. So if you're a clinician and you want to go from the section you're at, let's say you're in the first section, you want to go 3 sections forward, so you click the forward button, and it goes to the second section, which, by the way, for which the window is a different size, meaning that all those tabs and the next button change position. And then if you find out where the next button has gotten to and you press that next button again, it goes to the third section, but the window changes again, and again, and again, and again. So to move forward 3 sections, the user cannot just click next, next, next. They have to click next, look to where that damn button has gone to, move the cursor, right? Pick up the mouse, move the cursor, click it again, look, move, click, look, move, click. It's unbelievable. Can you ever imagine any of this happening on an iPad? Have you ever seen anything as badly designed as that on your Android phone? And I'm not even an Android fan. Right? This is absolutely abysmal. The fact is that my EMR is much worse than my iPad, but it's not just worse than my iPad, it's worse than my Facebook. My EMR is worse than my Google Maps. My EMR is worse than my TiVo. My EMR costs tens of millions of dollars, but it's worse than my damn TiVo. How is that possible? Well, what we ask our providers, we ask them, how is it that this is so bad? How is it that these things haven't been fixed in years of patient and user complaints and doctor complaints? When we ask them, you know what they do? They tell us these amazing, impressive myths. They tell us these incredible fairy tales, right? They tell us fairy tales like, well, you know, EMR is harder because doctors are resistant to technology. Now, I'm not an expert on Canada, but I can tell you in the United States, it seems doctors are either being told they're resistant to technology, or they're being told they're adopting expensive technology way too fast, right? Doctors resistant to technology? Yeah, sure. Doctors hate technology. Doctors never want to adopt technology, right? Except all the time. This is a myth. The second myth is EMR is harder because it's more complicated than that consumer stuff. But you know, when you think about it, and I do think about this, you know, Facebook is pretty much like an EMR, right? Facebook is a system that lets you keep track of all different sorts of people with different relationships to each other and different levels of privileges, and lets you put a timeline and a history of what's happened to those people. And Facebook lets you have, you know, as I said, different privileges, different roles. It lets you put text, images, et cetera. And in fact, if you look at Facebook versus my EMR, Facebook lets you do video and audio, in addition to everything my EMR does badly. And Facebook is also very, very highly integrated into a whole community, a whole ecosystem of other software, which my EMR is not. In fact, I still cannot, after years and years of trying, I can't see all my patients' labs from yesterday on the same screen at the same time. I have to go into 3 different systems. 3 different, completely different systems with 3 different passwords, which I have to change, God knows, about every second day. And I can't use any password I used the day before or the previous time, right? I have to do this all the time. This is a myth that it's more complicated. The third one is probably the most ridiculous, that EMR is harder because of privacy and security issues in health. Has anybody here, anybody use mint.com? All right, so I've got some people raising their hands. Mint is really an amazing system. What Mint does is it's a set of apps, a web application, a web page, apps for Android, iPhone, iPad, all this kind of stuff. And what mint.com does is it takes all the financial institutions that you deal with, and this is an example of mine, and this part is a little bit creepy. You give them your user ID and password to log into each of these institutions, right? So you have to trust Mint, and they go through a great deal to kind of win that trust. But once you do, what it means is that they're able to actually pull all the information from all those disparate institutions, all those financial institutions, which certainly I think we can agree have very heavy security requirements and privacy requirements, and create these amazing aggregated displays that tell you stuff about your net worth and your financial status and your spending that actually lead to greater understanding for you, which I think is what we're hoping to do with electronic medical records, right? To get greater understanding through better visualization, through electronic records, et cetera, but which we never actually seem to get to. Well, that's what Mint does. So again, these different myths that I'm told when I try to speak to the ironically named tech support department about why the EMR system, and by the way, I didn't know I was able to say the word suck until Dr. Mike told me, and I could tell, I don't know if Dr. Mike is still in the audience, but I could tell him that sucking less than this isn't hard. The fact is that my EMR system is worse than my iPhone because great programmers want to work on apps. They don't want to work on EMR systems. Certainly they don't want to work on these giant incumbent EMR systems, right? They want to go for work for Google, or as I said, they want to work for Twitter or whatever the latest Twitter is. That's where the money is. That's where they go. And importantly, if they want to make it in that field of producing these consumer apps, they have to pay, and this is so critical, intense, constant, daily attention to the needs of users. I know this because I'm a software developer now, right? I run a software company. We make software. We don't have grants. We give away 99% of our software. It's kind of a Skype model, you know, where you've got the free version of Skype, computer-to-computer calls, and the paid version. So we have 1% of our users paying for a paid version. That's the only money we have in my organization. You better believe I'm up all night. If somebody is using our software and they're not happy, especially if it's a paid user, I'm up all night and all weekend trying to make sure that those people are satisfied. something I don't think is happening with my system at Georgetown. The question then becomes, how do we get great programmers to pay this kind of intense, constant attention to the needs of the users in the healthcare system? Right? Again, this is something I didn't hear anybody else talking about. This exodus, right? The fact that we can't get the best people working on this incredibly significant problem, right? At least not on these, again, these giant legacy systems. And this brings us to the last chapter. Disruption ahead. So what if, as a patient, I had immediate, easy access to all of my healthcare data, no matter where it was located? Right? That would be great. What if, as a doctor, I had easy access to all the labs, even on one screen, all the labs, not with 3 logins, for all of my patients, no matter where it was stored? Right? We need to have companies competing to provide some sort of a secure and a useful interface to our health data, no matter where it's stored. I think this is, honestly, this is very, very analogous, perhaps not perfectly analogous, but very analogous to the Mint situation. Right? We have Mint, but what if instead of financial institutions, we had Health Mint? And in fact, all the pharmacies and all the EMR systems had to provide an interface to let people who had gone through the appropriate vetting process and with the appropriate security could compete to create great interfaces. Wouldn't it be nice if, as a doc, I mean, every doc I know in Georgetown Hospital has either an iPhone or an iPad, usually both. They bought it the day after it came out because they're so resistant to technology, right? But Dr. Mike knows they're just resistant to technology that sucks, right? So every doctor has one of these iPads. How fantastic would it be if you could say, oh, I'm going to buy this app, which I can authorize with my sort of user ID and password to get into all the information I have authority to get into. Oh, and then the next day I realize, a doctor friend of mine says, that app, that healthmint.com is pretty good, but there's another health something or other, another app that's coming along that's actually way better. And imagine if I could just switch like that. Because I don't even pay for Mint. Mint is supported by advertising. I don't even pay for that. Imagine if we had that for health records. Well, the fact is that this is coming. I suspect there are some people in the room who may be working toward this. This is coming. And both incumbents and lean, mean startups filled with programmers who have gotten their chops within the consumer market, these are all going to play a role. I'd like to first talk about the role that the giant incumbents, like the folks who make my EMR system at Georgetown, will play. Mostly, they're going to play the role of a stumbling block. Right? The fact is that dinosaurs don't learn to grow fur and become mammals. Right? This is creative disruption. Some of these companies will either go out of business or at least get out of this business. It's interesting, Nokia, almost synonymous with mobile phones for years and years. Nokia is completing a deal, you probably have heard, in January they're going to complete the deal to sell their mobile division. Now, most of us didn't realize they had any other divisions, but it's actually quite a large company. Their mobile division was about half of their revenue, and they're going to complete a deal to sell that. Nokia is getting out of the mobile phone business. Now, Nokia is going to be okay, but isn't it astonishing? I mean, who would have predicted that that's the case? But they're out. If you remember that graph of revenue that I showed you earlier in the presentation, this graph always reminds me, for very specific reasons, of another famous graph that I'm sure many people, if not everyone in the room, has seen before. This is the graph from Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, a book which if you have not read it, you need to read it. I'm sure everyone here has read it. But if you know someone who's only read the Wikipedia entry on Innovator's Dilemma, you need to tell them that that's not the whole story. They need to read the whole book. Christensen said basically that if you have sustaining technologies, non-disruptive technologies, little incremental changes, that's going to lead you to a steady path, which is you can see in that top arrow. But if you have disruptive technologies, truly disruptive technologies like the cost-cutting mobile web, that you will progress faster. And of course, this could be a graph. Christensen wrote it as a graph of technological progress, but it could be a graph of revenue because revenue follows good products, right? And in fact, the earlier graph I showed was revenue. The fact is that Christensen points out that there's so many examples. We think it's unusual for the leaders in a field to go out of business, to be driven out of business by some little David against their Goliath. It's not unusual. It's the norm. This is the way things happen. He points out example after example of disrupted injuries where these titans of the market get driven out of business because they couldn't change, and this is very important, even though they saw the change, even though they knew they needed to change, right? The iPhone came out in what, 2007, right? Innovator's Dilemma, subtitle, When New Technologies Cause Great Firms to Fail, footnote, see Nokia and BlackBerry. I'm sorry. Right, Nokia is getting out of the phone business. It looks like BlackBerry is getting out of business, period. Is it because BlackBerry didn't see it coming? Is it because BlackBerry didn't read Innovator's Dilemma? No, they read it. But their cost structures, the way they ran their business, made them unable to respond, though they knew they were going to die. That is a sobering thought. So it's kind of a good news, bad news scenario here, folks. The good news is, if you're a doctor or a patient, there are great apps that are coming that are going to give you more knowledge and more utility. There is a tidal wave of programming skill. There is a tidal wave of venture capital that is funding that skill. And you know what they say, when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail? Well, in this case, the tool we have is the internet and mobile and low-cost computing and excellent programming and web apps and all of that. And that hammer, they are applying it to one thing after the next. And now they are applying it to healthcare. And what we're seeing is, and again, I think some of the people are in this room, they're applying to places where they can make the easiest sales, small practices where decisions can be made easily rather than to large institutions. But the fact is, as those large institutions don't get so much revenue, the people who are providing to them, and as the people who sell to more and more small practices get more and more revenue, like that graph we just saw, when those two lines intersect, or actually probably before then, those old providers, those titans will fall. And that's good news for us. That's good news for me because I'm going to have a better EMR system at Georgetown. It's good for patients because they'll actually have visibility into their electronic health records. But if you're an incumbent maker of horribly bad EMR software, yeah, those great apps are coming, as I said. They're coming for you, and not in a good way. They're coming just like they're coming for desktop software, just like they're coming for the people who make console games. Remember those? They're heading for the junk heap. Just like they're coming for people who make dedicated e-readers, just like they're coming for taxi dispatchers, just like they're coming for all these businesses that web and mobile are disrupting. So we've talked about this giant secular change, this diversion of resources away from enterprise software to consumer software. We've talked about the absolutely appalling electronic medical record system I've used at Georgetown, which I have to say I've used probably 5 medical record systems in my life. This is probably the worst, but the others are no great shakes either. Although I'm sure there must be some good systems. I've heard Kaiser Permanente has an excellent system. And we've talked about the implications. What happens when you have really bad software being provided and then you have an engine to create amazing software that is sitting off in the sidelines waiting to turn its baleful eye on your industry. And that, as I said, is going to lead to good results for physicians and nurses and for patients. It's been a tremendous pleasure to deliver the talk. It's been even greater pleasure to talk to people during the breaks, and I hope their thoughts have been provoked, and I thank you very much.